Alright, today's class is going to be covering ground effect. Ground effect is a phenomenon that happens when a helicopter is within one rotor distance to the ground. As you're in ground effect, the induced airflow is being reduced by the surface friction to the ground, which when this happens, the lift vectors are increased, and as the lift vectors are increased, the angle of attack required to maintain that hover is reduced, which reduces the induced drag. The induced drag and the induced flow are two of the key components that allow that effect and allow ground effect to occur. So I'm going to start this off by showing you what ground effect or what induced drag is and how it is formed and created and the effects that it has on the helicopter. So induced drag is generated whenever lift is being produced by the helicopter. So as the high pressure below the blade tip meets with the low pressure above, vortices are being formed on the trailing edge and at the tips of the helicopter, of the blades. These vortices create a downwash that inclines the average relative wind as it comes in a downward and a rearward direction. But when this happens, before this happens, if there's no wind, the lift is being created in a vertical direction. Well, as this induced drag occurs and these vortices are causing the relative wind to move backwards and downwards and rearwards, the actual lift being produced is deflected backwards. This distance between the lift and the total lift, the actual lift being generated, is known as the induced drag. That is where, and the induced drag is the leading cause of drag on helicopter when it's at slower speeds. So moving forward, furthering this on to what induced flow is and how it's affected, we'll move up to the helicopter being out of ground effect. So when it's in out of ground effect, the air being in the induced air coming in kind of looks like this. That air is being forced straight down, and the vortices that we're talking about in here, the downwash, is being re-ingested back in, creating a larger angle of attack in order to maintain a hover. These and smaller amount of the blade surface area in order to generate lift. Well, when you move forward to coming into the in-ground effect, the induced air looks more like this. The air is, because of the surface friction that I talked about at the beginning of this, the air is being directed away from the helicopter. And with the reason with that happening, the induced vortices, the induced flow is reduced. Compared to having large vortices when you're in out of ground effect, while in ground effect you have much smaller vortices. With this happening, you end up having more of a surface area for lift being generated, but also as that induced flow is reduced due to the surface friction that goes all out, all areas away from the helicopter, the lift vector is increased and the induced drag is reduced. So as we're shown down here, as you're in ground effect, this portion of the lift is more like this, causing a much less amount of induced drag, meaning you get to use less power and a lower angle attack in order to maintain a hover as would be needed if you were in out of ground effect. So when you're looking at induced drag and induced flow when it comes to ground effect, it reduces the payload on the helicopter, making it much more efficient in order to maintain a hover while in ground effect, while closer to the ground, while then out. So the less induced drag means more lift and less power. And moving forward into when ground effect, it becomes at its max is in no wind conditions and across smooth, hard surfaces. When you end up getting into grass or rocky areas or water, these vortices are going to be increased. So which is going to increase your angle of attack, increasing your induced drag. So smooth, hard surfaces are the best way to go with that. So yeah, being in ground effect reduces the payload on the helicopter, the amount of power required, lower angle of attack, being on the hard, smooth surfaces, and the induced flow is reduced, which reduces the angle of attack, which reduces the induced drag, making being in ground effect much more efficient in order to fly.